What's up, gang? Welcome to The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius and I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, The Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I say, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius and boy, do we have a special guest. Dr. Kate Balestrieri is in the house. What's up, Dr. Kate?
Oh, thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh. Listeners, this is going to air on a Wednesday, so you don't know, but it's like happy Friday because it's Friday in my world right now. How you doing?
Okay. Glad it's Friday for sure. How about you?
I've had a, pretty good week. It's like I have a new business, which is kind of gnarly. And so I haven't had good weeks, but this has been a pretty solid week, like across the board. All wins.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that, and congratulations on your new business. But it is like having a puppy. The first year or two is kind of rough.
Yeah. I've started 22 businesses, and this one's been a more interesting one. So lots going on there. But hey, listen, what I'd love to do is get the show started. Guys, audience knows this. I always am out there like hunting for amazing humans to come on the show and for us to learn from. And Dr. Kate is a renowned sex therapist, and I saw her talking on social, and I'm like, oh, I want to talk to her. I mean, I love talking about sex. Seriously though, I was very excited to have you on the show to educate our audience and to talk about some of the amazing stuff you're doing. So if you wouldn't mind, do you mind if I go into some of your formal bio for people that aren't as familiar with your work, and then would love to talk some origin stories? Does that work for you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Awesome. You guys, so Dr. Kate is a licensed psychologist and certified sex therapist, founder of Modern Intimacy. She's a top-rated sex therapist in the United States, host of the weekly podcast Get Naked, and she has a new book coming out in February, What Happened to My Sex Life. Oh, man. All sex stuff. This is so cool. I'm so excited to talk about this stuff with you because I think it's such an important part that sometimes people ignore, and it's just something that we all should be more educated about. We've had some amazing people in the world come in here and educate us, and so excited to hear your thoughts. But Dr. Kate, I'd love it if you wouldn't mind giving, I know you weren't just born and then suddenly became a sex therapist. I'd love if you wouldn't mind kind of giving our audience some of your origins, some of your background. How did you get to where you got to?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So my foray into the world of psychology it's actually my second career. I started in corporate America, working in sales, doing employee benefit plans, and that was great. It was, lovely. I was in my very early 20s. But when I really looked forward and thought, I need something I'm going to do for the next 40 or 50 years. I don't know if it can be this, right? I needed something that was a little bit more creative, had more heart, had more oomph. And I decided to go back to school and pursue a doctorate in clinical and forensic psychology. And at the time, I was a complete true crime junkie. I still am. Love it so much. I don't love crime, but I love watching and learning and understanding the human condition through the telling of these stories, the retelling of these kinds of experiences. So for me, it seemed like a really fascinating place to work, just to understand what makes people do the darkest, most malevolent things to each other. So when I got into this field, I was primarily working in forensic psychology, and I spent the better part of 10 years working in and out of different prisons and correctional centers, treating folks who were incarcerated for sexual violence related crimes and some non-sexual but highly violent crimes. So, I worked with inmates across the spectrum of criminal behavior and mental health issues, demographic backgrounds, you name it. And that was really incredible learning. And in that space, I just learned so much about sex. And the way that I learned so much about sex is by realizing how little sex offenders knew about healthy sex. And that got me really thinking about how little we as non-incarcerated, non-sex offender humans know about sex, and the ways that we talk about it, the ways that we weaponize it, the ways that we use sex as a vehicle and as a journey for different needs that we have as human beings, in addition to having pleasure. So it got me really excited, pun unintended, but it got me very excited to think about how to have a career that really put sex at the forefront. Because when I first got into this work, I mean, it was almost 20 years ago now, and there just weren't a lot of women talking about sex in the public space, and I thought it was really necessary. So, my work evolved, and I decided to move into private practice. And because I had worked with pretty hardcore offenders, I could talk about just about any and everything with folks who weren't talking about stuff that severe or that acute most of the time. And that made it really easy for me to move into this sex therapy space where I could still help people move from a place of pain and suffering in their sex life, or frustration, confusion, into a place of stability and thriving and pleasure. So that's been the journey.
Oh, I love that. So, do you mind if I talk a little bit about the crime stuff before we get into the sex stuff, which both are two of my favorite topics?
Go ahead.
Have you watched the show Monsters about the Menendez brothers?
Yeah.
What do you think about that one?
I think there's a lot that we're never going to know about this case, about the reality of the case and the motivations of the brothers. I think they have their story, and there's lots of data to support that elements of it could be true, and there's lots of data to support that they could be malingering elements. So I don't know. I don't know what to make of it, if I'm being honest. And that's the reality of working with a lot of criminal cases. Sometimes you just don't know, and you're never going to.
Yeah, it's funny. I think like I just finished it, and I was like in high school when that happened, or when they were like when the trial was a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up in Southern California, so it was obviously like local.
Mm-hmm.
And my takeaway was I was like, yeah, I think to your point, I think that it seems to be, because given like the nature of the crime, I'm like, look, it seems to me like something bad would really have to happen to you at a really like formative age. Yeah. For you to do something like that, right? So I'm like, that kind of adds up, It's like no one just is like, hey, I'm gonna murder my parents with shotguns, because I want their money. You know what I mean? I'm like, that's a pretty like strong reaction to like just being greedy.
It is. It is. It does feel very feels hard to predict that two brothers would do the same thing, and that they could be in collaboration in such a cohesive way without there being some kind of origin story, if you will, or some kind of, not that abuse leads to violence necessarily, but without there being some rage element to make the motive so intense.
So when you start like thinking like as you were talking about your background, and there's like a spectrum here, right, of like crime associated, like sexual crime or like violence, and knowing that was a big part of how you got into the psychology and therapy, and my mom, by the way, is a LCSW.
Oh wow!
And so my mom was an LCSW that specialized in like essentially in like crimes against children. And so I grew up like with like, by the way, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, so like I was completely like expecting to get abducted out of a bathroom in a mall. Like that was just like a foregone conclusion of my childhood. I'm like, hey, like I'm gonna get abducted right now, because my mom embedded that in my brain, that I was gonna get abducted and molested. Yeah. So by the way, neither of which happened, okay, but I was convinced it was gonna happen. Every single white van I saw, I'm like, that dude's about to steal me.
Look, so there are some vans even today that do not do that myth any justice in debunking it. There's some scary-looking vehicles out there.
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in like America's Most Wanted was on Sunday nights, and so I would sit in my parents' bedroom by myself and watch it and just scare the shit out of myself. So like, just the audience doesn't know any of this about me, but like literally that was the shit I did. And so but for yourself, like starting off there and then shifting over into a more obviously less in, maybe it could be as equally as intense, but I guess less controversial, like just the normal intimacy coaching. Like what, like it's such a complicated subject, right? Because it's so personal, and
Mm-hmm.
and there's so many different parts that are involved with people, doing the things they do, whether it's for crime or for love. There's always, it's just such a wide topic. Like when you
Yeah.
start to look at your learnings and the themes across going from an extreme to a more, I guess normal, I don't know if that's the right
Mm-hmm.
word. Like what was it about that extreme part of the spectrum that you thought really has helped you to develop your practice and develop your learnings and to really be I guess a helper for folks on the more like casual side of the intimate spectrum?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that runs through as a parallel theme is that a lot of the offenders that I worked with were engaging in sexual behavior not for the pleasure, but because they were trying to express some sort of other need, usually a need for power or
Mm.
control. When we're talking about sexual violence, it's usually power and control, right? And folks weaponize sexuality and sexual behavior to obtain that power and control. So when I started to look at the ways that people were engaging in sex and the motivations for being sexual, it started to become very clear to me that, again, it wasn't always about pleasure. In fact, in sexual violence, it usually isn't. So I started thinking about how do non-sex offending people do the same thing? How do we use sex as a vehicle to get other needs met or to communicate how we're feeling or to investigate how we're feeling? And that to me started to flip on some light switches because most of what we're doing in sex is about pleasure, but it is also about curiosity and expression. And I think about how for most adults, sex is one of the few spaces where we really can play. We can live in fantasy and we can have all kinds of creativity and we can experiment with sensations and role plays and emotional experiences. So it becomes this landscape, this canvas, this vehicle for all kinds of expression and cultivation of the human experience. And so, in that way, there's a lot of similarity between offending populations and non-offending populations.
Interesting. When you start to like one word that was coming up for me as you were talking about that, and it's like, I don't know why this came up for me, but like shame, right? Like I think
Yeah.
shame is such a big part of, at least culturally, I think shame is a big part of has been, at least in my experience, around how people talk about sex,
Yeah.
around how people approach it. It's obviously very personal. And then
Mhm.
and as I've grown up and gotten older and more experienced in life, I noticed that there's like, I have friends who have kind of, I have a couple friends who are tantric, right? And
Mhm.
they're tantrika and they're just all about it. And when I talk to them about it, they're like, no man, like this is like, get all the garbage out of the way, and like this is about like openness and truth and honesty and using your sexuality in that way. So I almost
Mhm.
view that in of itself as a spectrum. So when you're working with folks, obviously people come from different backgrounds and experiences and cultures around this. Why do you think that we have such a culture of shame when it comes to sexuality?
Yeah, because of how sex has been weaponized and overcoupled with power, right? We have had a conscious for some people and unconscious for other people war on bodies in Western culture. Well, in many cultures, but definitely in Western culture, um, where we've determined that only people in certain kinds of bodies are quote unquote worthy of pleasure, rest, um, success, right? And this has all been overcoupled with power, wealth, and sexuality, gender, race. All these things have been fused in our unconscious culture and zeitgeist. And so, sex for a long time has been a weapon of control in systems of power that are looking to maintain power for some and not others. So this is, it's not a very popular subject to talk about. People bristle often when they hear me discussing this, but it is a reality of why sex became so overcoupled with shame. So when we look at the function that shame serves in getting people to do certain things, we start to understand, oh, wow, no one wants to feel shame. And
Right.
with shame often comes being ostracized or the fear of being ostracized. And because we are relational beings, we will do just about anything to remain intact with an in-group, right? As that in-group gives us a sense of safety, loyalty, meaning, purpose, belonging, trust, comfort, all the things. And that means that shame can become a very powerful tool to organize folks into, little buckets of groups. And sex is one of the ways that's happened. So, when we feel shame around sex, it's because somewhere, somehow down the line, intergenerationally, we got the message that if we live in our bodies and have pleasure in our bodies in a way that's really, uninhibited, consensual, of course, but uninhibited otherwise, then we're bad. And that's just not true, right? The human experience is ripe for pleasure. It's ripe for grief. It's ripe for all kinds of things. And, sex is one of them.
Yeah. So going the other way,
Yeah.
which is hedonism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, I've at least, depending on the source of it, but maybe let's say you remove the shame and it's just like a celebration of your body. It's a celebration of relationships, of just like, not attaching all the like attachments to the act of sex.
Yeah.
Like, when you start working with people that want to live much more in that direction, like, and obviously it's a personal choice, but I'm picking an extreme for point of comparison.
Mm-hmm.
How do what do you see happens with most people as they start to feel more comfortable, less shame, more like enjoyment? And I guess maybe hedonism is the wrong word. I like that word because I'm like, it's just like, that's like, there's like, hey, you know what it means when I say it.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you find that folks are able to start shifting more and more into that openness or that like frictionless existence, as opposed to this one where there's a bunch of weight around, oh, I can't do that, and oh, I'm this type of a person. Like how do you see that happening with most people?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up because this is the exact result of living in a society that represses and suppresses sexuality. You have all this restriction, and that's a pressure cooker. And so the minute people get a little taste of freedom or they want freedom and rebellion, they pendulate all the way to the other side and they go into that sort of hedonistic. It's very much this all or nothing mindset. And when you start to deconstruct shame from your sexuality, you realize that sex is great. It's amazing when it's great. And it's also not that big of a deal. And what I mean by that is that it becomes something that is no longer off limits. So it doesn't always feel like this thing that you have to indulge in, right? Because when we oscillate between that scarcity mindset and I've got to get as much of it as I can while I can, that does create a really polarized shift in people where they feel a tremendous amount of shame and then they want relief from that. So they go into the experience all in. And then they often feel a lot of shame, so they'll restrict. And so that sort of like binge and restrict pattern can continue. So, really working hard to de-escalate shame, to deconstruct it, to move away from shame allows you to have sex in your life in a way that is really integrated. And often when that happens, people don't need to live in sort of like a hedonistic way, to use your word.
It's so funny when you were just describing that. I was literally hearing you talk about like folks that have eating disorders.
Yeah,
like it's same. I've never heard it described that way. Like, do you think that kind of comes from that same place of like self-worth and like self-belief and like loving yourself? Like, is that kind of the same thing, but just different tool?
Absolutely. Yeah. Our relationship with food is also a relationship with nurturance, with sustenance, with connection, because we eat in social environments. We eat, well, when we're very young, with caregivers who feed us. So food is very relational, and it can be a metaphor for all kinds of intimacy related issues and concerns and joys and pleasures. So often when folks have disordered eating patterns or an eating disorder full blown, the food does become a metaphor for control, for power, for a sense of relational currency, if you will, and power in relationship. And sex, again, can be used in a very similar way.
Interesting. So I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
This is coming from me being a parent, and I
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about like the adult side of it. But going like I think a lot of this comes from like upbringing,
Uh-huh.
right? And obviously culture is a part of it, but I think a big part of culture, how you relate to culture, is really your heritage, right? Like how do your parents think about these things, and
Right.
how's it talked about in the home,
Yep.
and is it talked about in the home? And then because if you're in an environment where it's like it's bad, you shouldn't do it, you're whatever, like I'm going to use a word that I'm not going to pick a sex, but you're a slut if you do that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then
Mm-hmm.
like automatically like that the next thought is shame if you do it because you're bad, right? And I used to like joke where I'm like, I've never met a person who was like, oh, I want drugs, but I won't do them because they're illegal, right? I haven't met that person yet. And so like I have met people that are like, I won't have sex until I'm married or something like that, right? But the reality is, like, I grew up in Orange County, and there was a bunch of Mormons where I grew up, and we used to have a joke, like we call it Levi loving, where like they just like dry hump each other, and I'm like, well, like they're not really having sex, but like kind of like call it what you want, like that's a sexual activity, but like they make up this fake rule around what is sex and what's not sex, and the reality is like we're sexual beings, so we have hormones like especially young guys have a ton of testosterone, like they're going to want to do those things, so I mean we're DNA biologically built to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we know that, if we take away the social construct of shame and we say, hey, what is the healthiest way to approach this subject so that we have healthy adults that are not untangling the baggage of culture and family, and actually approach it the right way going forward? What would be your advice to parents to like approach this the right way with their kids?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first place where I would start is to give yourself some grace, because most of the parents that I work with are really, they're trying so hard to do what they think is best for their kids, and they're looking around and they're looking at social consequences and repercussions, and they want to make sure that their kids are set up well to be to fit in, to have friends, to be accepted. And that is what's guiding a lot of how they frame these conversations, or their absence of these conversations. In addition to their own sort of fear around sex, or hangups around it, or lack of education, you would be surprised how many parents I'm working with who have never even explored what BDSM is. Not that they have to like it or have to want to do it, but they don't know what it is. And that's not a condemnation on who they are, but that's a statement of how insufficient our sex education is in this country. So when I say give yourself some grace, that's the first thing. Like, you're not going to know a lot. And I encourage you to kind of forget everything you think you know about sex and relearn. There are a lot of really great social media channels out there for parents that are teaching them about sex positive conversations, and how to have sex positive, inclusive, boundary setting conversations with your kids. And it starts early, and it's okay if your kids are teens now and you didn't do this when they were young. That's okay. It doesn't mean you're a bad parent. But what you can do is learn how to meet them developmentally where they are today, and really start talking about things like bodily autonomy, boundaries, even things so little and seemingly innocuous as when aunts and uncles come over to visit. If they ask your kid for a hug and your kid doesn't want to give them a hug, don't force it, right? A lot of parents will say, oh, just go give Aunt so-and-so a hug. And they're meaning well. They want Aunt so-and-so to feel good, and they want that connection to build. But what they're telling their child is, your boundaries don't matter, and you have to do what other people want you to do with your body, whether you like it or not. So that conditioning starts really young, and we all inherit messages from our families that can be healthy or unhealthy. But like, bodily autonomy is a great place to start. And I recommend books like Boys and Sex and Girls and Sex, both by Peggy Orenstein, which are a great read for parents who really want to understand what their kids are actually exposed to right now. There's also a really great book out right now called Yes, Your Kid, by Debbie, I think her last name is Herbenek. And she does a lot of research into rough sex and sexual strangulation or sexual choking. And her book is about like how young kids are now that are being exposed to this kind of sexual behavior and how they think it's vanilla. Like the definition of vanilla is changing. So there are a lot of things that each generation is exposed to that we weren't when we were younger. So you got to forget what you know and start over, learn about things from the point of view that your kids have so that you can speak with them in a way that isn't shaming them and in fact builds trust between you and them as a parent. Because if they feel like they can come to you and talk about it, that's going to be a huge advantage. If they feel like they have to hide stuff from you, that is putting your kids at risk.
Interesting. You had me. I grew up. I'm half Persian, so like as you were saying all that, I'm like in Persian culture, like the men kiss each other, right? And as I grew up in like America, like because I have a Persian dad and an Italian American mom, and I was like, dude, don't kiss me. like these like my dad and his buddies would get like buzzed and like, Bubba June, come here and kiss my friend. I'm like, no. I'm like, I'm in high school. My dad's friends are buzzed, like wanting me to kiss them in front of my friends. I'm like, are you fucking crazy? You just reminded me. I just had a PTSD moment. Oh man. But the funny thing is like delicacy in Persian culture is this food called torshi, which is pickled garlic that they would eat before this, which is like, you should never have anyone kiss you if you're like anywhere. That is just wrong. Aged. Sorry. It was Kate. It's aged pickled garlic. You can imagine. Gosh. Yeah. It's black. It's black. And the blacker, the better.
Yeah. Delicious. But yeah, the breath. No. Oh.
Yeah, no. Listen, it should be like at least like not a felony, but like a misdemeanor if you ask for a kiss after eating that food. It's funny though. My kids, what I do is I hadn't thought about that because I don't know if I tell them to give hugs. What I do with my kids, though, that I notice a lot of other parents don't do, is I was really strict about teaching them to shake hands with people and look them in the eye and introduce themselves. Okay. And so, and you'd be surprised. Their little buddies come over and they're like, hey, my youngest kid's name is Pablo. And they're like, hey, Pablo's dad. I'm like, that's not my fucking name. Like, dude, let me teach. And I teach them. I'm like, listen, I'm Mr. Mershazadeh until I decide I'm Darius with you. Yeah. And Pablo, his parents' name's X. Make sure you call him that. So I'm old school, man. Like my dad was born in 1939 in Iran. That's like being born in the 1800s in the United States. So I'm old school. So pivoting over to like the parent side of the equation, obviously a lot of people, they'll get into relationships. I mean, I think that it's, in my opinion, and this is just me, like I've not done any statistics on this, but you tell me if I'm wrong. My sense is probably most people have mediocre to subpar sex lives. Like that's my like sense of if you were to like just like poll the population of people in relationships, whether that's married or just in intimate relationships where they should be having sex and ideally they would be having a good sex life. Like my sense is that most people they'd rate it mediocre to like subpar to bad. Yeah. A minority, I would assume, say they have an awesome sex life. Am I in the zip code or am I off on this?
It's interesting. My practice did a survey at the end of last year, and we asked that question. If you give me 2 seconds, I'll pull it up and we can talk about what people said. But it was, I was surprised, if I'm remembering right, about how happy people were, because I would have thought the same thing. So maybe folks are not being honest on the survey, but maybe there are a whole bunch of people who actually are pretty content with their sex lives.
Are these, hold on, let me ask a question just because I think population matters. Are these people who are clients or are these just the general population?
This was just something I put out on my social media. So I didn't have it out very long. We got about 230 responses, and I'll tell you. How satisfied were you with your solo sex life? The options were very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, and dissatisfied. And 37% said they were satisfied. Dissatisfied was only 14.5%.
Can I ask a question? Is solo meaning that they're like not in a serious relationship, or is this with themselves, like one-on-one?
Masturbation, one-on-one. So they can be partnered or not in real life, but the sex that they're having by themselves, they were.
Wait. People, wait, give me those numbers again.
37.3% were satisfied. 21.9% were very satisfied. 26.3% said neutral, and 14.5% said dissatisfied.
My gosh, 1 in 5 people like are good at pleasuring themselves. Like
they're satisfied. That doesn't mean. I think those are two different questions. So they might not be satisfied with the frequency, or they might feel like, wow, I don't have enough time for this. I'd like to do it more.
Wow, that number blows me away. I would assume like it's like you're in control of that, you know? Like that's amazing.
Kind of, but look, a lot of people have kids. They don't have time to like go pull up the kind of erotic media that they want to consume while they're watching porn. They don't have 15 minutes or 20 minutes to get themselves really comfortable and go to town. You know, they're like trying to be efficient in the shower before they go to work in the morning. Like people are trying to sneak it in and work it in and get it going in ways that are not disruptive to their family system. So it's not always something that folks have made time for or feel like they have permission to do. Because a lot of folks feel like, oh, I'm partnered now, I'm married now, I can't do that anymore. I have to be sexual with my partner only, or those are their fidelity agreements, which I don't necessarily agree with, but to each their own. And you know, they're like doing their best to try to just get through the day.
I've you know, what's funny is so I know people where they're like, no, that's cheating, and I'm like, okay,
yeah,
I'm with you. I'm like, no, it's not. I mean, look, I don't want to be judgmental here because some people might consider it cheating, and I agree. Like, it needs to be good for you and your partner, and there needs to be some agreement around it, and that's the respectful thing to do. I do think though, like, let's just assume that the partnership's healthy and that you're cool with each other doing that stuff. Like, people, like, invest in a fucking lock for your bedroom door, and and here's the other thing, because I had an argument with my sister, not about this subject, but about the quote, I don't have time for like something. Mine was, this is like, we're in political season, this is around doing research on candidates. And I was like, I'm gonna call bullshit here, because the average person is on social media or watches TV like 3 hours a day, right? And so I'm like, listen, you don't have to be like, if you have time for that, then you have time for this. That's my opinion. But you know, maybe I'm biased.
Maybe. I think there's a lot of variables that probably go into play. Not least to say things like mental load, right? When some people say they don't have time for something, it's they don't have the emotional or mental bandwidth for it, and that's a really different conversation. Which
Fair
is
enough.
why you can zone out and numb out with social media for 3 hours, because it doesn't require anything.
True. I've been accused of not having empathy, so forgive me. So okay, so that's solo. Let's go to non-solo. I want to hear this date. That blew my mind, by the way. I'm so shocked.
But so the question, how satisfied are you with your partnered sex life? You're right. 55 people, so 24.7% said they were dissatisfied. 20% said they were satisfied. 20% said they were very satisfied. 18% said they were not partnered, and 15% had a neutral response.
So that's like half. That's better than I would have thought.
Yeah.
It's like half are at least satisfied or very satisfied. Now I'm going to throw a curveball at you in that if someone's on your website, it's something that they care about.
For sure.
So you could have some it may not represent the general population. It may represent people because anyone that's like looking at a sex therapist website probably cares about sex, right?
Well, yeah, or they think they should care about it and they don't.
Or even that, right?
Yeah. There's lots of reasons people come to see a sex therapist, but definitely, I mean, it's a bit of a self-selecting population. If they are following a sex therapist, they're at least curious about it. They're asking questions and trying to figure out, what place does sex have in my life? And yeah, a lot of people don't prioritize it, and that can be okay too, right? You do not have to be having a magic number of sexual experiences to be considered having a healthy sex life.
So for people that want to have a better sex life with their partner
Mm-hmm.
or with partners, whatever their world is. Like when you start, like, is there any like top 5 or top 3 things where you're like, look, if you want it, like obviously you can go see a therapist, and I get that's your business, but this is a complicated subject, so it's not like read this one article in Vogue and you're gonna have a magical sex life. I get that, but where are the high notes? What's like the top 3 to 5 things you're like, listen, if you focus on these things, like it'll make things better. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but it's probably going to make things better for you.
I would say the thing to really think about is that we have 2 systems that sort of regulate our arousal in the body. We have what's called our sexual excitation system, or as Emily Nagoski calls it in Come As You Are, our accelerators for sexual arousal. And then we have the sexual inhibition system, which she calls the brakes, right? So think about your arousal as like the gas and the brake pedal in a car. We all have things that when we hit the gas, like our arousal goes up and it's wonderful and exciting. We can access pleasure. We get lubricated. We get erect. We get all the things. It's fun. But we all also have brakes. We have things that shut that whole thing down. And we usually have more brakes than we do accelerators. So when people are feeling disconnected from their sexuality, or they're feeling lower desire than is accustomed for them, the first place that I go is, what are the brakes that are getting in the way of all those accelerators being accessible? So those are things like burnout, stress, mental load, like we just talked about, sometimes medication side effects, or a medical condition might be taxing the body in certain ways. Relational conflict is a huge one. When folks do not have appropriate repair in their relationship, that is a quick shutdown for a lot of people's desire and their arousal, because it doesn't feel emotionally safe. And so it doesn't feel physically safe, sexually safe for their bodies to say yes. Everything we're exposed to in the media can play a role in that. Work, stress, parenting. One of the things that shows up a lot is for parents, especially, being touched out, especially the primary parent, which is often a mom, not always, but often. And what that means is that there's just a lot of physical touch demands on that primary parent's body. And so there's a lot of overstimulation. So then at the end of the day, their partner's like, hey, do you want to get going? And they're like, oh my God, I can't imagine one more person touching me or needing me, like, get away. Right. And so the question that I really start with is, what are the brakes and what can we get off of that side of the equation? So where can partners support each other to have more downtime, more focus time, more embodiment time, more relaxation time, more ease, more repair, more connection? Once we identify what's getting in the way, then the path to eroticism is a lot more clear.
That's really interesting, and I love that. It's like you're mitigating the risks, right, by like eliminating the things that are stopping. That seems like a pretty logical first step, and then that opens up the opportunity for connection.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Like what in your opinion? Like a lot of, I think that especially if people are like, I've heard friends of mine talk about this, that have been in relationships for a long time, where the perspective is that, it's like you kind of get into a routine. It gets boring. It's like eating the same meal. It's a great meal, but it's the most amazing omakase meal I've ever had, but I've had it 1,000 times. So it's not like when I first had it. What's your advice for people that want to try new stuff, change it up, but they're intimidated by the fact that it's like it's new and there's risk, and I'm sure that comes up a lot in your practice. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It does. Yeah. Well, I love that you highlighted that sometimes while novelty is what is desired, it does come with the unknown, and with the unknown there are risks. That's part of why novelty is so exciting. We have more psychological space between what we know and what we don't know, and that creates tension. It creates curiosity. It creates motivation to know. So that's where desire and novelty really are lovely bedfellows. But yeah, it doesn't always go well. So I think there's a lot of risk for couples to talk about with one another, and they can do that by One, creating a culture of non-judgment, right? So one thing I like to tell couples is that, or even folks who are coming in on their own, your fantasies don't mean anything about you as a person. They don't mean anything about your worthiness. They don't mean anything about your character. Fantasies are an opportunity for us to get creative in the human experience. And they often give us an inlet to some kind of emotional experience or sensational experience that we can't get in our everyday lives, or we don't even want in our everyday lives, right? And the reason I start there is because a lot of folks come in and they're like, I want to try this thing, and I'm afraid if I tell my partner, they're going to think I'm weird, or they're going to think I'm a bad person, or they're going to think I'm not quote unquote normal. But I guarantee you, if you like it, someone else on the planet does too, because we are really diverse creatures, but everybody likes different things, and there's going to be other folks who align with you. But even if your partner's like, hey, that's not my jam, can you stay curious about what that fantasy means to your partner? So I'll give you an example. I work with a lot of partners where one person is vanilla, one person is kinky. So they're like, we don't know how to have sex because we love each other, we have a great relationship, but I want to get into this and my partner is not into it at all. And so we clash. And so the exercise is to think about, in the kinky fantasies and even in the vanilla fantasies, what are the emotions that you're trying to feel during sex? What are the sensations that you're trying to feel? Let's start there, because that's actually what you're after. And more often than not, they can find some alignment, right? They want to feel connection. They want to feel seen. They want to feel supported. They want to feel powerless. They want to feel powerful. Okay, great. Well, there's a lot of themes there that are overlapping. Now we have some commonality, and that gives people a place to start getting creative on how they can, one, see each other and understand each other more effectively, but then come up with ideas for play that actually creates synergy.
I love that. That's such an interesting intersection, especially if people, because I do think that humans tend to be kind of, we live in the gray, but we act like everything's black and white, right?
Yeah.
And because our left side of our brain just like, give it to me mathematically, and the right side's like, no, I'm creative. I want to, like, there's nuance. So that's interesting. It gives some guardrails of where is there that overlap so that people can start to work from it. So once they discover, let's use the example you gave of vanilla and kink. Once you discover that, oh, I want to feel power, and the other one's like, no, I want to just feel intimacy. Like, how do you let's use that. I'll just give that, because that was when you were saying it. I'm like, someone that's more vanilla just maybe wants to feel connected, and the other one's like, no, I want to feel power.
Yeah.
What would be the next step after that? Because that seems like those are obviously different themes.
Totally, kind of. But there might be a lot of overlap. So we need to get more granular around, what does connected mean and what does power mean? Because there are different ways to be connected and there are different ways to feel powerful. Some folks want to feel powerful as in they want to be in control of another person's body, right? They might have a rope rigging fantasy, for example, or a bondage fantasy of another kind. And for them, that gives them this experience of being in control. But there's a safety there, right? It's not like, I don't want to hurt you. I want to be in control of this sort of scenario. And that might feel really scary for someone who's never played in that space, but maybe connection to them means trust. Okay, so here's an opportunity to maybe start with some small things. And how can you build trust in a way that maybe doesn't involve this intense kind of bondage yet, but maybe there will be room for that, maybe not. But how do you start to build trust? Because what this person wants is to be in control and to be trusted in their power. And this person wants to trust in their connection. So there is a connection there that can be foraged.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know we're getting near the end of the show here, but this is a topic that I've seen this come up with a lot of. It's interesting. A lot of friends or people, maybe not like good friends, but just a theme that's come up. Maybe it's. I don't think it's an Austin thing, because I noticed it in San Francisco too. The concept around open relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that be like, it seems to be talked about a lot more now than I've noticed in the past. And I'm in entrepreneurial circles. People tend to be more progressive and like kind of like risk taking. So maybe that's part of it. But it's just something where like I never heard of it before. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, me and my wife are in an open relationship. I'm like, okay, that's surprising. Right. And so what what are your thoughts on that? Like, how are you seeing more of that now? Are you like, and when you do, or people that, like, even going back to the example you gave before of like the two partners have totally different beliefs or different interests, how has that came about in your practice?
Yeah, it's a really common intersection that we're seeing in practice with people wanting to understand what is non-monogamy, what is polyamory, what are open relationships, what is a monogamish dynamic, how do we make sense of the balance between novelty and safety. And I think a lot of people are also starting to come to terms with the fact that there's a lot of compulsory monogamy. And what that means is that we've been told that monogamy is the only healthy trajectory. Every Disney movie that we see, all the rom-coms, they portray monogamy as the inevitability, right? The focal point for relationship. But monogamy is a relatively recent human structure. We didn't always have this sort of path down picking one person. That's only been around for about like 4 to 10,000 years. So prior to that, we were very much a non-monogamous, community-based culture. And that meant that people were sexual with different people, and there wasn't this like pair bonding thing that happened, for the longevity of lives. So I think a lot of folks are really like questioning, does monogamy really work for us now that we're living longer? And the reality is like the divorce rates are super high, and there's a reason for that. It's hard to go 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years with one person because there is this inherent struggle between I want to feel safe and I also want to feel excited. And safety often requires a level of familiarity that snuffs out excitement. And excitement requires novelty that introduces risk. So, it's a really hard place for people to be. So what I would say is that there isn't a right or a wrong way. There's a continuum of people who prefer monogamous dynamics and non-monogamous dynamics. What makes them healthy or not healthy is, are they mutually agreed upon with all partners involved? Are people being transparent and really intentional about how they create boundaries and honor boundaries? And are they working hard to be strong communicators in these dynamics? Because that is what's going to set the stage for it to be a healthy scenario, whether we're talking about monogamy or non-monogamy.
A follow-up question on that is, do you kind of see that the same way as people having differences of interests? Is this just another example of difference of interest where, like, people having those conversations, whether it's what they're interested in, monogamy versus non-monogamy, that kind of feels to me like more unsafe to have that conversation than if you're like, oh, I want you to dress up a certain way and you don't want to. That feels like way like a less risky conversation. I mean, do you see that to be true, or do you think that's a misperception?
That it's riskier to have the non-monogamy conversation?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it can be. It depends on where the partners are. You'd be surprised how many times one partner's been holding back and saying like, hey, I'd like to try this. And the other partner's thinking the same thing, but they're both afraid to bring it forward because they don't want to hurt their partner's feelings, or they don't want to start what they believe will be an inevitable avalanche toward divorce. And sometimes that does happen. But oftentimes when partners really prioritize creating that culture of non-judgment and curiosity, and they wait to act until there's agreement, like that's a big key. It can be something that brings people closer together and actually gives them the space to be more of who they want to be in the world, which allows them to be a better partner with their partner. So it's not for everyone, but for the people who are interested in it, it does present some risk, because if your partner's not into it, it might signal a really difficult decision that you have to make, right? Between what is the truth that is burgeoning within me and how do I protect this relationship that I really care about? And that's a hard place to be.
Yeah, that it makes sense. But I think it kind of goes back to the beginning part of the conversation, which is like, do you feel shame around being honest? And
Mhm.
it doesn't matter what the topic is, but this is a shame-ridden conversation or subject that has a lot of like pre-shame that you have to work through. Assuming it's gone, now it's like, okay, well, like, can you have an honest conversation of what you're interested in? My perspective, that's my read on everything you said, is like, it sounds to me like the therapy practice is an opportunity to bring in a third party
Mhm.
to be able to facilitate a more honest conversation. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Look, as I said before, we have really paltry sex education in this country. And that means that a lot of people have never learned how to talk about sex. They've never really learned how to think about sex, especially as it relates to pleasure or thinking outside of like a heteronormative, mononormative framework for sex and pleasure and relationships. So I think it's a really great idea and a really smart idea. Obviously, I'm biased because I'm a sex therapist. But I
Right.
think it's a really smart idea to bring in somebody who can help you, one, get educated and figure out what you don't know that you don't know, because it's a lot, right? I've been in this field for nearly 20 years and I'm still learning new things every day. So, as I said before, give yourselves grace because there's just a lot to learn when you start exploring a new dimension of sexuality. But bringing in a sex therapist can help you expedite your knowledge around, how do I fill in the blanks? How do we fill in the blanks? And can help you really get curious together about, again, the meaning behind some of the desires that people have, which can take some of the sting of the risk out of it when you have a deeper understanding of what is strong in our relationship. How do we protect our relationship as we take these risks to become more expansive in these ways. So it's a great place to process and have a mediator to help you understand each other where you're getting stuck. And that's a big part of what we do, is helping folks kind of land, regroup, and then go expand in their sexuality.
Love that. Well, so you have, I know we're towards the end of the show. I want to get to the greatness question, but before we get there, I'd love for you to give the audience, how can they connect with you? You have a new book coming out. Maybe talk about that in the podcast just for a hot minute here, and then we'll end up on the greatness question and get you on your way.
I appreciate that. So my book, What Happened to My Sex Life, is really a conversation. It's written for women, but anyone can read it. And it's a conversation about some of the most common themes that I'm seeing in practice for why women are feeling less and less connected to their sexuality, to their desire, and how do they reclaim it? How do they get it back? So that's coming out in February. And my podcast, Get Naked with Dr. Kate, I'm on a little bit of a break from it because I've got some really cool new research that I'm doing these next few months. But I'll start back up with it in 2025 early. And it's basically a conversation about the intersection of sex, mental health, relationships, and it's really fun. So you can check it out. It's on all the platforms, and new episodes coming next year. But probably the best place to find me is my website, modernintimacy.com, and my social media handles, Dr. Kate Balestrieri on Instagram, TikTok, and Modern Intimacy on YouTube.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put all that in the show notes. And guys, go out there, support her book launch and the podcast when she turns it back on. And you can listen to the past episodes. I'm sure they're amazing. With that said, you want to do greatness question? I'll get you out of here on this Friday afternoon.
Let's do it.
All right. Dr. Kate, you ready for it? Let's do
ready.
it. What is the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how have you overcome it?
I would say the number one barrier for me and for a lot of folks is self-abandonment, right? When you stop listening to your body, when you stop being present in your body, when you stop really being present with yourself and nurturing the relationship that you have with yourself, you lose a lot of valuable information about how you feel with the people around you. And then that shapes the way you do or don't set boundaries, the way you do or don't protect your time, the way you do or don't expect pleasure and reciprocity in relationships of all kinds, the way you do or don't negotiate for compensation, the way you do or don't foster creativity. So self-abandonment is one of the, I think, most sneaky and insidious places where people can lose themselves a bit on their path to greatness. But reclaiming that relationship creates a more embodied truth, and that is a pretty unbeatable start for becoming who you want to be.
Love that so much. Dr. Kate, such an honor and so much gratitude having you here coming on the show today. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you. This was wonderful. I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you so much. You guys go out there, support Dr. Kate. If you guys need a good sex therapist, she has all the locations. She does it on her website, so you can check that out with her and her team. Get the book, listen to the podcast. And until next time, peace out. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers, and after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.